Hey, what's up?
Oh, hey, hold on one second.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Hey, all right. So I think we're on. You can hear me,
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. How's it going, bud?
man. How are you?
Pretty good.
Good. Thanks for doing this. I figured my friend Paul, he said that bait, and I didn't think you'd actually respond, but you did. So I figured this would be cool.
Yeah, we talk to all types here. So, do you want to introduce yourself and give your background and everything?
Yeah, so my name's Kevin. I wasn't gonna give my last name, but it's in the Twitch title, so I guess I will. It's Kevin
Oh, holy
Butterhoff.
shit! I'm sorry. I thought since you were like an author, I thought that you like. I'm sorry. That's my
Sorry.
bad. I should have asked.
No. It's not that big a deal.
Okay.
As long as nobody in your chat's crazy.
Okay.
um, yeah, so I've done a couple pieces for Ario magazine. The two I've done mostly been on race, or chat with Sargon on the transgender issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I generally aligned with his point of view, but I think he put together he just didn't seem prepared. He didn't put together a very good argument, I thought.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I got a position here written down. I figured it'd give us a good jumping off point, so I figured I'd read it, and then we can just
Go from there. Yeah, sounds good.
So my position is, historically speaking, the words man and woman have represented a dichotomous categorization of all people. So the division of people into these two categories based on the ability to reproduce, meaning the category of man can genetically reproduce with the category of woman.
Mm-hmm.
They're highly correlative with man and woman, but the dichotomy is divided along the ability to reproduce and not those correlations. The third group, labeled intersex, however, this group is defined explicitly in relation to the traditional categorization.
Mm-hmm.
Given this is not the defining characterization of man and woman, such a definition would undermine the utility of the modern categorization. Saying a trans woman fulfills the meaning of the word woman outside of a euphemistic sense is a logical contradiction, similar to saying A is equal to not A.
Okay.
Women and trans men should generally be referred to as trans, maintain both fundamental logic and the utility of the categorization.
Wait, can you repeat that last statement? I cut out a little.
But hear me?
Oh, hello? Oh, I can't hear you. Wait, hello? Can't hear me? I cannot hear you. Are you using the web client or the actual downloaded client? Web client? Maybe it would help to download the actual app. Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, that's really weird. I didn't do anything.
Oh, weird. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, what was the? Do you remember the last statement that you said that I asked you to repeat?
I'll do the last paragraph. So I said, given this, personal identity is not the defining characterization of man and woman, and the utility of the modern categorization. Saying a trans woman fulfills the meaning of the word woman outside of a euphemistic sense is a logical contradiction, similar to saying A is equal to not A. Trans men should generally be referred to as trans, maintain both fundamental logic and the utility of the categorization.
Okay. All right.
That's my position. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I guess like I would take issue with almost the with the very first statements you've made. So I would reject the idea that the category of man or woman, the utility of it today is to describe people's reproductive roles in society. Go ahead.
So I think so. Reproduction is one of the fundamental drives of humans, right? It's reproduction happens at a cellular level, animal kingdom, everywhere. So you might think the category of man and woman, maybe that's not the best definition of how we use it in society anymore, but there's still a role that's got to be filled. There's that categorization still has to be filled. We reproduce as humans. So even if you disagree that man and woman don't describe that, there's still got to be something to describe that. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, like at a reproductive context, we could. Well, actually, even in a reproductive context, those words fail because not all men are fertile and not all women are fertile, right? So even
Right.
in that reproductive context, it doesn't work, right?
Right. So there are, you know, so that's why I said the category of man. I think this is where Sargon failed. It is the category of man mates with the category of woman. So there are, women who've had hysterectomies. There are
Hmm.
men who aren't fertile. But the category is still into reproduction. So you can have somebody who doesn't necessarily fulfill that ability, but it's still the two dichotomous, truly dichotomous because there's intersect, but you know what I mean. They still fulfill that role of producing with one another.
Yeah, so I mean, I would be an idiot to not recognize that there is a dichotomy um, between the male and the female in like a reproductive role. I just don't think that we use these words. Like, it's very, very rare, I think, that we actually refer to like man or woman in terms of like reproductive capabilities. So, for instance, if I ask my friend, like, hey, who are you going to hang out with today? And then the friend refers to somebody named Samantha, and then they either refer to her as a her or a him, like very rarely are we trying to describe that person's reproductive role in society. If anything, I would say that your reproductive role is almost entirely obfuscated, save for a conversation you have with a doctor or like a very close loved one when you're talking about having children. It just seems to me that like when we talk about like what does it mean to be a man or what does it mean to be a woman in today's society, like most people wouldn't give reproductive roles anywhere near the top of their list of answers. If you list the top 10 traits of male or female, like in terms of like societal definitions, like reproductive roles are going to be
Right?
probably not even on that list. Sorry, go ahead.
So I guess then, how do you define gender, or the concept of a man and the concept of a woman?
So I mean, in today's society, it seems like, so if we talk about like I guess like gender categories, it seems like we can make a broad set of statements about men, and then we can make a broad set of statements about women, that seem to be somewhat true most of the time. So men tend to wear certain types of clothes. They tend to exhibit certain types of behaviors. They tend to wear their hair in a certain way, right? And then same thing for women. Women tend to shave more than men. They tend to have these features that men don't. Like it's more when we get into like the societal definition, then we move away from this dimorphic definition to like a bimodal definition, where we see there's like a lot of overlap between left and right. If we're not just talking rigidly about like reproductive roles.
Right. So to me, this seems to undermine like the feminist agenda, which was, that to be a man, to be a woman, um, it fulfill these gender stereotypes of these gender roles to be a woman. And I agree with that part of feminism. I don't really agree with modern feminism in a lot of aspects, but that's one I agree with, which is you can be a woman and you can be a power lifter, you can be an engineer, you can not shave. None of these things define woman to me. Um, so that's what
Um,
I think about it.
Yeah, so actually, I would actually agree with you there. We might actually find a lot of agreement that in those realms that I think there is some level of harm when it comes to kind of like having these definitions of man or woman. But the direction that that takes you to is going to be for the abolishment of gender categories altogether, not to a more rigid definition of male or female gender categories, I think.
Uh, I think if you were to abolish gender categories altogether, then you do kind of lose that bimodal. There are correlative traits, um, psychologically speaking. James Damore did his whole memo on that. That they in Slate. Um, so
Yeah, I mean there are correlative traits
I
everywhere,
definitely don't
but
think you can get rid of the categorization altogether. I think then you kind of just throw everything in disarray.
well, but I mean, I think we can. I mean, obviously that would be like a pretty radical shift. But like when I tell you that somebody is a man or I tell you that somebody is a woman, we're really like you're only getting like a broad. Like I guess the thing that hurts is that like you tell me that like the category of man or the category of woman, sits here to assert some reproductive role. But if I tell you that somebody is a man or a woman, you actually have no idea what their reproductive capabilities are. The woman might have gone through menopause. The man might be infertile. You actually have no idea. But we still use these categories every day because we're clearly referring to things that aren't related at all to reproductive roles, right?
Right, but I think the same thing could be said about your definition. Was I could tell you somebody's a man, but that doesn't mean you gave a couple examples. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that towards math. I think you can always.
I agree with what you're saying. I 100%. I totally agree with
Okay.
what you're saying. But that drives me towards the idea that gender as a concept is outdated and we should abolish it altogether. I don't know how you get from what you just said, which I agree with 100%, that calling somebody a man or a woman isn't even necessarily descriptive of any characteristic about them in today's world. Maybe these categories aren't even useful anymore. I totally agree with that.
So part of the second point of my position was to say, you know, for people who feel one way versus the other,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's a man who feels that they're a woman, and so to me, the way we resolve this the best way we can. Okay, you're, instead of a woman, you're a trans woman. So, and then we can use the proper pronouns. So we can use, so in your polite conversation, you're out to dinner with somebody, and you would use she and her, you know, the proper the pronouns they prefer, and still maintain that, okay, they're a trans woman. They're not a woman, they're a trans woman, and there are some aspects of conversation where we say, well, we'll just defer to woman instead of trans woman. But I don't like the idea of just completely dropping this differentiation. I don't see the utility in dropping the categorization. I only see disutility.
Sure. So, well, let's talk about that actually, because I'm really curious. Because there is utility there. So nobody in the world feels like a trans anything. That doesn't seem to be something that people are programmed for. You either feel like you fit into this idea of man, or you feel like you fit into this idea of woman. Like a trans woman isn't a man that feels like he's a. Oh wait, hello.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
What about non-binary? You know, somewhere else.
That's a whole other. Those are like a fraction of a percentage of even like LGBT people. But like, I mean, those we could talk about that too. But in terms of like trans people don't feel like a trans person. They feel like somebody of the other category, right? So I think the idea of like referring to like trans women and saying that there's a separate category for them called trans women, when the entire point of like hormone replacement therapy and everything is to make it so that they, you know, their gender expression matches that of a woman and not just a trans woman. It seems to undermine that entire treatment process. Like, I don't know if that would be as an effective way of helping these people deal with gender dysphoria. And then, or you can respond to that.
To me, then, it sounds like also your logical conclusion kind of get rid of gender as a construct entirely. You know, then that also seems to undermine whether, well, I feel like a woman. Well, there is no woman.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with you, but that path takes us to gender abolitionism, not to more rigid gender roles. So I mean, like, yeah, if that's a position, I mean, if that's a position that you want to argue for, I would probably be in agreement there. And I've talked to at least two transgender people that have told me that, like, possibly in a different society, maybe they wouldn't feel trans because the way that the gender expression works would be so much radically more different that they would feel like they do identify as whatever, and it's not like this huge like mismatch between what they see themselves as and what they are. But in today's society, we do still have gender roles, which is where the gender dysphoria seems to arise from. That you see yourself in a different way than what your body actually is, which is a big problem.
Right. So I mean, you know, I definitely don't like gender roles. I think there are roles that women will gravitate to, but I don't like the idea of gender roles because it's like you're then pushing somebody there, and that I don't like. I think that's a attack on liberty in some sense. But
I guess like the question I have for you is because you made a statement that's very interesting. It kind of gets to the point of this. Let's say trans women are just called women and trans men are just called men. What utility are you losing? What actual harm is being done to society if we redefine these categories in this way? What are we losing?
Yeah, well, so then this goes back to, you know, the historical categorization and the biological categorization. So autonomous minus non, you know, intersex. And when you say that categories are mutually exclusive, particularly at a biological level. So when you say, well, a man can be a woman, then you're fundamentally on its head, because that's why I kind of put in my position. It's like saying A is equal to not A.
Well, so I disagree with this A is equal to not A, because when you say A is equal to
Okay.
not A, we're talking like very strict forms of deductive logic, right? We're not talking about like universal categories that can very easily be redefined from one thing to another. If we change the way that we view what a chair is and it starts to encompass the category of table, like we're not breaking fundamental rules of logic and saying A is not equal to A. We're just changing how we define like chair or table. So I mean, I disagree with this analogy that we're using to like strict deductive logic. So back to the point. I'm very curious. Like we can say a lot of words like we're breaking science or whatever. But what are we actually losing if we say trans men are men and trans women are women? Like what do we actually lose in society if we do this?
So going back to your chair thing,
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be like saying chair is not a chair. So it's not that you compare chair to table, but to me it would be chair to not chair, because they're aren't dichotomous. Chair and not chair are dichotomous. So man and woman, in my view, and I think the view of most people as of right now, is man and woman are dichotomous.
Yeah, I guess I just can't accept. I mean, we could go back and drill on this, but I don't accept that that's the way that we use these terms today. I don't accept that when John says, I met a girl from work, I'm gonna go hang out with a girl, that like the stand-in for that is I met somebody that is capable of reproducing with me. I just don't think that's the way that we use these categories today. 99% of circumstances, when you go to the store and you see like women's clothes or men's clothes, it's not clothing for people that are capable of reproducing on this side of a dimorphic like dichotomy. That just seems like a really strange way of viewing it.
I agree with you that there's a lot of instances where we've substituted man and woman where it doesn't go back to that original categorization by ability to reproduce. And I think the gave good examples. But there are examples where we do. So there are examples in the law. Kind of gets to the bathroom idea, the controversy. And to me, the bathroom controversy is not the real controversy. There's deeper there.
Well, like, what if the bathroom controversy doesn't make sense? What if we just had bathrooms where everybody can go in? Like, is that big of a deal?
Okay, so let me give you an example, and here's where I think it gets difficult. So,
okay,
there are women who will go to spas, right? And in these spas, you have the full nudity sections of the spas a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get rid of this man and woman and you say up and or now we're going to put them together, and so now you've got women and men in the full nude that are being in the same place, and it's going to be uncomfortable more for women but for men as well. And then it goes a little bit further than that, especially when you're talking about like transphobia. So, for instance, if my girlfriend were to go to one of these spas and a man were to come in, like a man, somebody who identifies as a man, whose expression is a man, were to come in the full nude, very uncomfortable, and get into transphobia. So, okay, maybe that person identifies as a woman. Then you're going to shame my girlfriend for being uncomfortable because a trans woman is a woman. So there's a lot of things you said that I think are true, but I think when you dig down into it, there are instances where these categorizations matter, and then when you go into shaming, calling somebody transphobic, it really gets to a problem.
So I mean, like so I'm gonna ignore the fact that there are saunas and there are public places where like people are nude, and it's not a big deal. I mean, it's kind of ironic because like I've been in Sweden for a week and like it happens here where people are nude, and believe it or not, like outside of America and on a lot of Europe, like people are comfortable with nudity without wanting to kill themselves. Like when I go to bathrooms here, like I can walk into a bathroom and it's weird as an American, but like I walk into bathrooms here and women walk out, and I keep thinking I've went into the wrong place, but it happens here, and society hasn't fallen apart here, and it seems to go okay. But like even if we ignore all of that, like you could just as easily change the signs to like people with penises on the left, people with vaginas on the right. Like if you really wanted to, if it was that big of a deal, I don't think it would be. And I mean, like, not to mention that like we're brushing over like a whole other thing. What about people that are homosexual? Would you be comfortable in a spa with a gay guy walking in next to you? Like, is that something that's going to make you uncomfortable too because he might be sexually attracted to you? Or are these people supposed to go in with the women, or?
That's a good point. going to, penises in one area, people with vaginas in another, I think that, especially when you're saying the genitalia doesn't define, that seems a little.
Well, genitalia are
problematic.
genitalia. Like like a trans woman with a penis isn't going to say like, well, I've seen some extreme trans people say other things, but generally, like a trans woman with a penis isn't going to say, like, oh, well, this penis is actually my vagina, typically. So I mean, like, I think like trans women with penises would be okay going to the penis section, and then trans men with vaginas would go to the vagina section. Like, I don't know if people would necessarily have a problem with that, but like, you're only looking at this in terms of like seeing people that like you're thinking of only people that definitely don't pass as well. So like for instance, like when we talk about like the bathroom thing, people like I want trans people to go to their own bathrooms. Like to the real bathrooms, not the ones they identify with. Well, okay. Well, to use like the emotionally loaded example, how would you feel like it if your little girl went into a bathroom and then right behind it this big trucker guy walked into the bathroom and you're like, what the fuck are you doing? And the trucker guy was like, hey, I'm on HRT and I've got a vagina, but this is the bathroom you want me to go into, so here I'm going in. Like I mean, like it would be like just as ridiculous, I think.
That's why I don't think the bathroom is the idea, because you're just using the toilet. You're in privacy most of the time anyway.
Uh-huh.
I think going into like that sauna thing when you talk about prisons too, and prison sports and these full nudity places, public places, is where I think it breaks down. The bathroom, it's like saying allow to go into the women's bathroom, then by the same logic, you're going to allow them to go in these other places that are separated for a reason. So the bathroom.
I mean, I guess, but like for that same argument, for the spa thing, the trucker dude would be there too. So your girlfriend is at the spa, and this big trucker dude that's been on HRT for like the past like 5 years is gonna walk in and sit down next to her. She's like, "Excuse me, what the fuck?" He's like, "Oh, sorry, I'm a trans man, so here I am with the real women, and I'm a woman, and they're gonna be hairy and bulky and whatever, because that's what testosterone does to you. Even women, if they take enough of it, like, do you want them going into the cis women spa, like?"
Oh, so you're saying a woman who has and going into the woman's spa.
Yeah, so like a trans man, so a woman that's been on hormone replacement therapy, that's getting testosterone, you would want that person to go into the spa with your girlfriend, somebody that outwardly looks like a male and in every size, shape, and form, except the fact that they have a vagina. Like they would be hairy on their chest probably, they probably would have very small, if any, boobs, like they would have a deep voice, like.
Right. So what I'm curious, how would you handle that in your definition? How would you handle that in that situation?
I mean, I think that areas like these, I think these are kind of like niche things. I don't know how often like people that identify with the gender in a spa like really impacts things. Mixed gender stuff is probably fine. In America, we hypersexualize the fuck out of everything. Everything is so sexual in our society compared to other countries. It's insane. It would probably be okay to mix it up, but I mean, like in terms of like the general like thought I have, like trans people have like such an elevated risk of suicide because of everything that they have to deal with, and like for me to just call trans women women, I don't really lose anything. Like I don't think I lose any descriptive power. I could still ask somebody like, hey, like I want to have children with you, are you capable of doing it? Like that's a question. If I was dating a trans woman or a cis woman, I would have to ask the same question either way, right? Because I don't know if a woman is fertile or not. There are a lot of women who are XY women who actually have no idea that they have XY chromosomes. They don't even know that because they haven't been tested for it and they haven't tried to get pregnant. Yeah. So I mean, like I don't think I lose any descriptive power by calling trans women women or trans men men, and it seems like it benefits them a whole bunch. So I just don't see a reason not to.
Right. Well, you mentioned suicide, so there's a lot of statistics on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there's at least a couple studies where, at least one study where I think it looked at down the road after they have transitioned, and it found that there was still hyper elevated levels of suicide even after they had transitioned 10 years down the road.
No, there's not. So I'm familiar. Yeah, no, there's not. I'm familiar with what you're citing. Ben Shapiro cited the same study. So the methodology of the study, if you go and read it, it actually had to do with the lifetime suicide attempts of people that had transitioned and who hadn't transitioned. Just because you transition doesn't mean your prior suicide attempts go away. One, two, you would expect the people that went through the effort of transitioning to have higher suicide attempts because their gender dysphoria was so bad that they sought treatment to transition. Right? The people that have the least amount of gender dysphoria are probably the least likely to commit suicide. And three, the author
Wait,
of that.
so you're
Yeah.
saying, wait,
Mhm.
I just got to pause right there. So,
Yeah.
so you are saying that there is a correlation, you're saying it's a mental illness that people who feel the need to transition, that it's not just because society is treating them wrong, it's because that there is an underlying mental illness.
Well, so what is getting into what we pathologize is really difficult. People debate the fuck out of that when the new editions of the DSM are prepared. I'm not qualified to say what is or isn't like an illness. So just going by
I
the
agree.
book, the illness related to trans people is referred to as gender dysphoria. It seems like in the current edition of the DSM, the
It's been
things that
changed. Let's make that clear. In 2013, right? It was changed. It was originally gender. It was something else, but I'm pretty sure it changed in 2013, right?
Sure. So typically, what we call a mental illness today in the DSM, from my awareness, what we call a mental illness are things that impair your daily life. So the thing that we call a mental illness related to trans people is something called gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria means that you see yourself in a certain way, like internally, and it differs so much from your outward appearance to society that it causes like a great anguish that you experience mentally. And this anguish leads to other mental illness like depression or anxiety that can cause you to become suicidal or to self-mutilate or do a whole bunch of other horrible things. Like that. So that's the part that we call mental illness. Just being a transgender person is not considered a mental illness, but having gender dysphoria is the part that we consider a mental illness, and that's what we try to treat. So we treat that through like sexual reassignment surgery, SRS, or hormone replacement therapy, HRT.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot of activists who would disagree with you calling gender dysphoria a mental illness. I don't think it technically is
Well, I don't wait. What do you? I don't think anybody
DSM-5 is a
would
mental
disagree.
illness. I'm not an expert, but
Yeah, no, I don't think any activist would disagree with that. I don't think. Or they wouldn't. I'm confident that they wouldn't.
okay, then maybe there's something I don't understand with the activists. To me, it
Sure.
seems like that calling it a mental illness in any way seems to be a point of contention.
Well, okay, so like there's a difference between being transgender and having gender dysphoria. So being transgender, that's just the state of I was born biologically male, but I identify as a woman. That's what being transgender means. Gender
Okay.
dysphoria is I am so different. I feel like I'm a man and I have a vagina and boobs, and that difference is causing me extreme mental anguish. That's gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is what we treat. We don't treat transgender people to like make them be okay with whatever they're born with. We treat the gender dysphoria by helping them transition to how they see themselves. That's what the current APA stance is, and that's what all of our treatments are geared towards right now. That seems to be the most effective way of dealing with gender dysphoria.
You're saying that the difference is in gender dysphoria, there is a lot of mental anguish that's not necessarily the case with all transgender people.
Correct. So there might actually be like there are trans people. There are trans people that I was born a man. I really feel like I'm a woman. And that sucks, but it doesn't cause me like a great deal of anguish at the end of the day. So I wouldn't have very much gender dysphoria. So like I wouldn't have that big part of like the mental illness part. Those people do exist, yeah.
Okay.
And then there are other people who like the gender dysphoria is like kind of shit. They're like, ah, man, like this is kind of a drag. I don't like this. And then there are other people like this gender dysphoria literally makes me want to fucking kill myself. I am so different than what I see myself on the inside, and I cannot live this way in society. Everybody treats me in a way differently than what I would like to be treated. Yeah.
With that, to me, it does sound like with that explanation that you are saying that the primary underlying issue then is not a mental illness, but the way society treats them because of the way they see themselves.
That's correct. And that same study that you just referenced, that Ben Shapiro cites all the time incorrectly, in that study, the researcher, she mentions that a trans person's likeliness of committing suicide or trying to do self-harm after transitioning is directly related to how much support they have from the people around them after transitioning. That's like a huge part of the success of a person's treatment.
I mean, you agree it's a gender dysphoria, at least, is a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if disagree on anything there. But I don't know if there's any study that says once a person's transition, it comes down to the suicide rate comes down to the whole.
No, it doesn't come down to normal, but it absolutely comes down. It absolutely drops. Yeah, that's why it's the recommended course of action by the APA. Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess I go back to kind of what the main point of disagreement is.
Mm-hmm.
Say something like a trans woman is a woman, so it's a person who's a man.
Mm-hmm.
You've changed the definition to the point where you're taking something that belongs to two mutually exclusive sets in my world, and object or data point that belongs to set A can now be a part of set B, even though they're mutually exclusive.
I understand this argument. We keep trying to bring this back into like a realm of logic where I'm not going to necessarily disagree with you. Like your conclusion here logically follows, but I'm taking issue with your premise that we do rigidly define these categories in the way that we do. We just don't. Are you able to click links right now on your?
Yeah.
So if I were to tell you, for instance, that I was gonna go meet my friend, and she's this is like my friend and she's like really cool, and like you saw a picture here, like should I refer to this person as a she or a he? Like, because
trans friend of you?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's trans or not. So this is a guy called Sneaky. I don't know if he actually is trans or not, but he cosplays as women. But like, it would be very confusing to you in a conversation if I kept referring to somebody like this as a he, right? Because you're not thinking of like reproductive roles when I refer to somebody. There's other characteristics that we're generally thinking of when we talk about like he or she. Like there's other things going on. And actually my favorite evidence of this is when Ben Shapiro is having a conversation with Joe Rogan, I think, and he's trying to misgender somebody to prove his point. He keeps messing it up because he keeps thinking of the person he's trying to misgender. He thinks of her as a she, even though biologically they have a penis, because that's outwardly like what she appears to be. And even he keeps messing it up in the conversation, which I think kind of points to the idea like it's hard to have this argument because like we don't have like these rigid definitions of anything in society, right? Language is very descriptive. But like I don't think that we use these like man or woman words to like say like this is the biological reproductive role this person fills in society, you know?
Right. So I would say to the model you put there.
Mm-hmm.
So if I knew this person and I knew that it was a man that cosplayed in women's roles,
mm-hmm.
refer to them as men. If I didn't know and I was saying, you showed me this picture and we just started talking about this person, I'd call her she.
Yeah.
And then your point about he does agree. So I had that conversation with Blair White. I don't know if you saw it, where he's like, if we were out to dinner, I would just call you she, because you're right. It's the easiest. It just kind of flows naturally. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's not. I agree that if somebody who's got transitioned, that in polite conversation, it makes sense to just call them. If Blair White wants to be called her, it makes sense to call him her.
Sure.
Fits within my worldview. I don't think that. I don't think that changes anything to me, at least.
Well, but I mean, like this is how it works, right? So. We can circle back. There's like we can have a debate. I don't think there's a debate here, but you can have a debate on how language works, right? Is language prescriptive or is language descriptive? Is language something that a book has a definition and that tells us how to speak, Or is language descriptive? Do we try to like account for these are the words that people use and this is how they tend to speak? Personally, I don't think there's any merit to the prescriptive side of language. People change words all the time. In fact, if you go and look up in the dictionary, in Webster's dictionary right now, if you go and look up the word literally, it literally has underneath it figuratively, because that's how people use the word so often now, right? This is literally the worst day of my life, you know? Like language just kind of like tracks like what people say in society. And if that person, so this person, this cosplayer is sneaky, if he was standing next to another guy, okay, in a convention, and I would ask you, hey, could you go over there? Could you go and bring her over here without telling you which one it was? Like, it seems like you would go and grab Sneaky if he was dressed in this sort of outfit.
Yeah.
So like for me to refer to him there as a he, it seems like in that case, your original argument was one of utility. It seems in that case I'm actually losing utility there by strictly referring to him as a he, because it doesn't seem like that word actually maps on to reproductive roles like you originally kind of wanted it to.
Oh no, because I agree that you probably would call. It gets confusing. Where you'd probably call him a she, and you're right. I would grab.
Sure. So, like, for all intents and purposes, if you never actually saw this person's genitalia, which for 99.9% of people we don't actually see their genitalia, the way that we identify people is usually with, like, outward features that fall under the category of gender expression. So, like, if I see somebody and they have smooth legs, long hair, they might wear dresses or rompers, they might have a lot of jewelry, they might wear makeup in a certain way, like, I usually call this group of people women. And I don't actually know if they have vaginas. If they have vaginas, I don't know if they're capable of reproducing, but there's just this general kind of category that maps onto this, like, a very bimodal distribution, right? Because, you know, some men have long hair, some blah, 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 but, like, that's just kind of how we address people in society. And I think that having, like, a trans woman that hits enough of these categories addressed as, like, a woman, I don't know, I don't see any damage there in society. If anything, it makes things a little easier. I can't imagine if I met, like, Blair White, like, publicly, like, trying to say, like, hey, could you bring that trans woman up here? Like, no, I would just call her a her. She looks like a she. Yeah, I don't know why I would ever have another category for this person. It seems to make things more confusing than anything else.
Right, but I don't know if anything you've said there conflicts with my say. Okay, you know, we'll use the pronouns. We agree on that. But at the end of the day, we're being specific. We say, okay, this person's a man and this person's a trans man.
Yeah, but like, who's saying this? Who needs to say this?
Your debate with Sargon to the analogy to stepfathers, and I thought that was a pretty good analogy. So in most cases we refer to a stepfather as they have guardianship, you know, there's a strong bond there, emotional bond, but we maintain that distinction between a stepfather and a father. So what I'm trying to do is maintain a distinction.
Yeah, but I'm just asking, like, where does this distinction matter? That's what I'm asking. Now, like, I would agree with you, for instance, if a trans woman, or I'm sorry, if a trans man wanted to walk into a reproductive clinic and demand to donate their semen, and it's a trans man, so it's a person with a vagina, I'd be like, okay, well, hold on. This doesn't work, okay? Like, well, this now the category is actually relevant here because this is very important, right? Or if a trans woman was trying to get pregnant with a cisgendered husband and goes to the doctor and is like, well, I don't understand what's going on. It's like, okay, well, you both have penises. Like, you can't get pregnant, right? Okay, well, now this is important, right? Now the categories are actually relevant. But for 99% of our daily lives, I just don't think that using these categories in a reproductive fashion is very relevant to what we're saying. Like, in the vast majority of how we refer to people, we don't really know anything at all about their reproductive status.
Yeah, well, I think when you're talking about all the fundamental, when you dig down to it, what's the difference between a man and a woman, it comes down to biology. So when you conflate these terms, when you don't make a distinction, I think it becomes confusing to then talk about biology. Especially, you know, you're an evolutionary biologist, someone like Brett Weinstein. One, it makes it difficult to teach. It makes it difficult to learn.
Well, so, like, that's no. I disagree with this. Like, We could still
Uh,
have plenty of conversations about biology with trans people being referred to as like trans women being referred to as women, trans men being referred to as men. I'm gonna forgo the whole part here. First of all, if we really want to get into the science and the biology, even the concept of sex becomes very messy at a final level. Like no biologist that studies like actual like things related to sex is going to tell you that there's like this rigid distinction between like male and female. They're not. It gets a lot more messy at the intense biological level. But we'll ignore
in
that.
in when you're talking about things outside of humans, you
Even
I assume
things
you're referring.
related to humans, there's a lot of weird shit that happens. Like, it's just, but like even outside of that, like I don't see how trans people are going to make it difficult to teach a biology course. Like they just, I don't under, I totally reject that. I just don't see that ever happening. Like you're like, well,
The
what is?
language, because say okay, a person with biologically male organs who has XY chromosomes is a woman. You talk about reproduction in biological settings when you're teaching it. You can't make these names.
I mean, even
It's
in biology, you're not typically talking about like the like the women dogs or the men dogs. Like you're very usually restricted to talking about like biological sex. You're saying like male and female, not like here's the dog man or whatever. I just I don't know. Like and then when you're referring to like functions of organs, right? Like you don't like these are the male testes versus the female testes, or this is the male ovary versus the female ovary. Like I just don't think in biology like having trans people makes things that confusing. I don't think it. I don't know. I just I'd be very curious to
I
hear from like from a professor like to say like it's very hard to teach biology now because trans people exist. That would be a very hard argument to sell. I think.
um yeah, see, I don't know if I agree. In my worldview, I don't think it does because there is a clear distinction when I say trans woman and woman.
Hmm.
But when you conflate these things and you um, have the antonym as part of the category, then I think it gets very confusing. And then additionally on top of that, so this is I think where the conversation eventually will lead is what else. So if you want to say okay, gender is identity, and people typically on the right or who don't buy into this typically say, well, I identify as an attack helicopter, and what sounds silly, but then you get into things like otherkins, who are people who identify as animals.
Yeah. So
No
otherkins,
rodent.
yeah. So I actually don't care much about like the social justice narratives or anything related to that shit. I don't care. I just go by what the science says. So the APA, as far as I know, has never recognized like otherkins as like a group of people. I
I
don't think
think
these are.
species dysphoria is species dysphoria. I'm pretty sure it's there is a Wikipedia entry, and I think the Wikipedia entry. Sam, is that in here? So even if it's not in the DSM, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when this conversation eventually goes down its logical conclusion, it very well could be added to it. In this case, we'd be having that conversation at that point. Then it becomes when you say you can just identify as something else, um, you kind of go down the rabbit hole. You open Pandora's box.
So I
Um,
disagree. So this is like so I would argue that this is a fallacious use of slippery slope, and that you would have to actually establish how we would get from point A to point B. So I'm telling you, trans people exist. They've been recognized throughout all of history, and people literally kill themselves because of issues arising from like gender dysphoria. If you want to posit that well, people identify as attack helicopters or other kin or whatever, then I'm going to ask you to establish that like a little bit more. Like, are there actually people killing themselves because they feel so strongly that they should have been Sonic when they were born, or they should have been like a dog? Like, I don't think that this is something that is
I don't know if
documented.
they are killing themselves. I genuinely don't know. but they do exist. I mean, there's documentaries on them. And what I was getting before, when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, he mentioned a friend of his who owns a company, and there was an HR complaint about somebody who identified as a cat, and they put an HR complaint because they didn't have litter boxes. So, that's an anecdote, but
yeah, I mean, like there are documentaries on people that fuck car exhausts. I mean, I'm sure there are like one. I'm sure we could find like a one-off of anything. But in terms of like otherkin or attack helicopters being something that's like cited in the literature that is like included in, maybe they'll make the DSM-6 and I'll change my mind. Like I don't think that this is like actually a problem that is worth addressing.
Well, that's where I completely disagree. I think that as soon as you open up something that has originally been defined by biology, this like the dichotomy that's been defined by biology.
Well, so
when you question that, you would have to question other things.
So it's careful. You have to be.
It will lead there. It does lead there.
So we have to be careful to make this statement. First of all, biology doesn't define any categories. All of these categories are arbitrarily defined, right? What is a man or what is a woman? We can't take these definitions from science. Like we give these things definitions. All biology can do, all the science can do is analyze and describe the world. It can't tell us how we should group things or how we should or how we should like categorize things. These are 100% human constructed things. Right.
So this sounds like you're making a social constructionist argument, which go down that road when you say, okay, is math socially constructed? Then again, I feel like you're opening up Pandora's box. I don't. Do you think math is socially constructed? What do you think?
So I would argue it is. But mathematical realism or anti-realism is a far, far, far cry from whether or not universals come from any scientific discipline. Because math isn't something that is like empirically analyzed like a science. It's a really different thing. I think. I think that math is something that stems from axioms. So we have to have a discussion on like epistemology to argue mathematical realism or anti-realism. I don't even have to know what epistemology is to argue about whether or not categories from science exist. Outside of a scientific discipline, and they don't, right? Like, does like every category that we make is socially defined because we have some use for it, right? Like, if what is a computer? Well, does a computer exist? Well, no, there is no such thing as a computer. It's actually a collection of plastic and motherboards and graphics cards. That's what a computer. Well, but we say computer because there's a use there. When we describe a computer, when we give that category, there's some utility there. Same thing with male or female or man and woman. Like, these are broadly, they map onto some physical characteristics that we've decided are probably important, and then that's where these like broad categories come from. That's it. No study or no investigation into biology is ever going to tell you man and woman is how you ought to group these two things. That's a normative thing that never comes from science. That's 100% something that we have to socially construct.
And see, when I think about this, when I think about whether or not something is socially constructed, so like again, you talk about math. The symbols we use for math are socially constructed. But whether or not the underlying phenomenon is socially constructed, that's, well, no, they're obviously, like you said, the biology exists, and yes, we decide to categorize things based on utility, but there is a fundamental human drive to reproduce, preserve the species. So to say that the categorization is socially constructed is, because when I think socially constructed, to me it's almost like you're saying it's arbitrary. We could have defined it as something else, but
well, so to be clear, it's not arbitrary. Socially constructed doesn't necessarily mean arbitrary. I could socially construct something to provide the maximum amount of utility. So that social construct isn't arbitrary. It's a social construct that gives me the most utility. So, for instance, like, do you think that tacos are like a feature of the world? That tacos are like the category of taco. If every human being were to be destroyed, like a taco would exist. Like independent of all mankind? Like, probably not. Like a taco, or understanding of a taco, or even
the category of nourishment is.
Nourishment, sure. But let's say we'll say like taco or like sandwich, right? Like a sandwich is something like this could be like so many things, But just because it's arbitrary, like we could define a sandwich as anything, or rather, I'm sorry, just because it's a social construct doesn't make it arbitrary. Like if I say like a sandwich is anything we kind of want it to be, we've defined like, but this is what we've defined it as. A sandwich is like two pieces of bread with a piece of meat in the middle. And you're like, well, that's socially constructed. I go, well, yeah, of course it is. That wouldn't mean that you just go, oh, well, that's arbitrary. This cell phone is now a sandwich. Well, no, hold on. Just because I've socially constructed the category of sandwich doesn't mean that it's arbitrary. I just have the social construct because it provides some utility to me as a person. Same thing with male and female. Like male and female, in a scientific sense, generally provide some utility to us. They broadly describe the differences between like a dimorphic species. And then man and woman, in a gender sense, broadly describe or map on to some differences of bimodal distribution of features in a society. But that's it. Like that's all they are. They're not like derived from science in some hardcore way. And I disagree again with the original assertion that man or woman literally means like man or woman means like reproductive roles in society, because we can both give a million examples where we call someone a he or a she or a man or a woman, and we don't have any idea what their reproductive role is. We're totally guessing. We don't know at all.
Well, I mean, so what about someone who, a woman who identifies as a woman, but is very what we call butch, very, got a lot of masculine features,
Mm-hmm.
participates in a lot of masculine roles, traditionally masculine roles. At that point, do you go to woman or do you go to male?
So I mean, for me, I guess it's just basically how they choose to present themselves. Right? Like, what do they prefer to be called?
It's not. You're saying because they identify as a woman, then we will call them a woman.
Yeah, I mean, generally, yeah. I mean, that's kind of what we do with names
So
already,
then we're
right?
not going to the stereotypical features. So truly call them a man. They might look like a man that much. This argument, I think, kind of chips away at what you were saying before. Like the screamer and calling him a woman because it looks like a woman. Well, now you got this woman who identifies as a woman that looks like a man. What do you default to?
Well,
He
I mean,
would
these
be
are two separate arguments. One is like, should a trans woman be allowed to be
okay.
considered a woman? And the other is like, how should you address a person? I think these are two separate arguments. I address a person with whatever they tell me to. I mean, like, I don't, like, that's it, right? I mean, even people that are broadly critical, like, imagine like Ben Shapiro opens a debate with like, hello, I'm Ben Shapiro. And I go, I'm sorry, you're not Ben Shapiro. You're Benjamin Shapiro. Like, if we look at your birth certificate and analyze it, like, it's improper of you to introduce it like that. Well, that's ridiculous, right? We typically address people as they want to be addressed. But, like, how you address a person is a separate discussion from, like, can a trans woman be considered a woman, I think. These are two separate things.
Well, no. I mean, there is a distinction. The distinction is mostly irrelevant. For the most part, there are
Mm-hmm.
cases like in the law where Ben versus Benjamin may be relevant. But I think that you could say the same thing about man and woman. So you have a lot of laws that were written that like where all female facilities, all male facilities, that these things were written, I think, with traditional categorization in mind, which is the biological one, and then to go back and reinterpret and say, well, no, gender doesn't mean women, it means identity. I think it opens up a huge issue there in how we interpret things that were written the other interpretation with the other definition in mind.
I mean, like, again, like, if I go with your world, like, let's say that I make like an all women's gym where the women are only comfortable around other women, and then because of your rules, I get like a trans man that comes in, and he's like hairy, he's full on hormone replacement therapy, he's got a beard and everything. He's like, well, sorry, I'm here because this is where I have to be. Like, I don't know, I don't think in that sense like it even passes your own test. Like, wouldn't we want this person to go to the place that they identify with?
But you're saying whenever we have these, like the sauna,
Hmm.
that wherever they identify with, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I think. I don't think it causes that many problems.
I think it does, especially like you said in America, and especially in America it does. If I were to go to the sauna and I were to walk in there into the women's section, I think it would cause a lot of problems for the owner. I think he would lose a ton of business. I think there are women who would feel very uncomfortable, and I think there are potentially even women
Yeah,
who
but this
might
would.
feel
But
traumatized
don't you think this would
from
happen?
other past experiences.
Don't you think this would happen just the same if a trans man walked into the women's section?
I think it could, but then it goes back to, okay, what do you default to? And to me, the default is the biological categorization. So,
Well, like, so
you're
you see
saying,
that you saw that picture I posted earlier of Sneaky, right? Let's say that somebody like that walked into your sauna as a man and you were like naked or you were showering. Wouldn't that make you uncomfortable? Like,
um, I don't know if necessarily make me uncomfortable, but I think you could say it would make some men uncomfortable potentially.
so what do you do there? Is it
But it
just
would work in the same way in your world too.
well, I mean, in my world, I would say that like
People take
people should be
advantage of it
able.
in your world.
So this has never been demonstrated to have happened. Where people like abuse like the trans things to like sneak rape people or whatever, or like sneak sexually harass people. Especially because
Take
trans.
advantage of it.
What?
If you really go down that road where you're saying, okay, we're just going to go with identification, you could absolutely take advantage of it. Whether or not it has happened, I don't know if that's relevant. It's if somebody who is looking for victims identify as trans, they could be a man who victimized women, could then misuse this women. So to me, I agree there are difficulties. I agree
Yeah, but
that
this
there are
this
some fringe cases like you're describing, but I default back to the original categorization. I don't think there's a better way. I think that's the best way. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's the best way. I think your definition, I think, leads to more problems.
but I totally disagree. Like, I don't think that anybody would be happy with a trans man going into like the women's bathroom.
Didn't say it'd be perfect. I agree. It won't be perfect. I think when you default, when you say what are we going to default to, I think you've got to do that. Because I mean, imagine this: you have somebody like Jocko Willink, who obviously not Jocko Willink, but somebody like him, who gets arrested, and they're now going to go to prison. They commit a very violent crime, and they say they want to go to. Let's say the violent crime they committed is serial rape. They want to identify as a woman. They have on their, they foresaw this, so even on their driver's license, they've identified as woman on the driver's license. When they refer to themselves as woman. I've got all this documentation. I can prove that I identify as woman. I want to go to this. I think you've got a really there. Again, you could say
yeah, so well, like, okay, so
realistic,
like this is like concern trolling on like an unbelievably imaginative level. Like
no.
Well, so like here are the facts. Well, so like
where the logic leads.
Well, so
we're
like
talking about where the logic leads.
well, let's get away from the logic, the quote unquote logic part, and let's go to the actual empirical world. So empirically speaking, what you've said, I am not aware of this ever happening ever. I do know that right now, statistically, trans people are like 13 times more likely to be sexually victimized in a prison than a non-trans person. So to like engage in this level of concern trolling, you're like, well, maybe somebody when they're 18 will put the wrong gender on their driver's license and then a year later be a serial rapist, all so that they can go to the right prison to go in and serial rape. Like, this is like a fantastically fictional account that I don't think has ever happened. And you're using this to argue against something that today exists and is hurting people today in statistically significant numbers. Like, that seems like a bizarre argument to make.
I genuinely don't know the numbers on this. Are you saying that the trans population, non-trans population in prisons experience higher rapes?
Absolutely. It's like 13 times higher, I think. Yeah. And that's not just in prison either. Like, that's in normal society too. Like, trans people are more likely to be victimized, like in a plethora of situations outside of prison environments as well.
I know that they're more likely to be victimized. I mean, I know that. I'm not aware of rape statistics in the trans community, but
sure. I guess like I'm trying to think like. Honest to God, like if somebody were to tell me that like hot dogs should be considered sandwiches, like this is probably something that would cause me more issues in my life than than trans women being called women. Like if somebody tells me like a trans woman is a woman, I'm trying to think like, okay, well, where could I have like a bad thing happen in my life? Like I can't think of something. Whereas if I were to go to a Subway and they were to be like, what do you want? I'm like, give me the best sandwich you have, and the guy behind the counter gives me a hot dog. That would be like a measurable harm in my life. Like, okay, well, hold on. Like the category of sandwich exists for a reason, and hot dog sure as fuck doesn't count.
I, I
Whatever.
definitely don't agree with that. I think that there are there are measurable harms in both worlds, but I think to say that there are no measurable harms, you may not be the one victimized, so that's why you wouldn't think about it.
Well, but like the
But
only harms
I
you've
don't think
given me so
there are no
far.
measurable harms. There certainly are.
Well, but like the only harms you've given me so far are like pretty fantastical hypotheticals. Like this idea of like the trans
There's
rapist.
hypotheticals. We haven't gone there. You know, in 50 years, if we do go down this route, they wouldn't be hypotheticals. I mean, these things would be happening. So they're hypotheticals for now. I don't see why that matters. Part where you said where trans women are getting raped, I agree with that matters, but I don't think the fact that we're talking about hypotheticals matters.
I guess like it
hasn't
just.
had time to happen yet.
Well, I know, but like this is what I mean when I say concerns. Like, the problem is that like so like right now it's something like 150. You have like 150% higher chance of being sexually assaulted in like a bathroom if you're a transgender girl that isn't allowed to go to the girls' bathroom. If you're forced to go to the male bathroom as a transgender girl, you have like a 150% chance of being sexually assaulted versus like going to the bathroom as anyone. Like what? Or wait, I'm
You said
sorry.
150% chance, a higher chance, but
Yeah, a greater risk. Yeah. So like, if this is true, and we know this is true now, and there's data that says this is true now, why would I not advocate for a changing of categories to alleviate this now, based on a future concern of something that might never even happen? Like, that seems like a not good way to. That seems like a not reasonable route to go down.
so to me, when we talk about things like that, is what's the utility of the way it's currently described? So we're talking about the bathrooms, and it's always been man woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you raise a good question as should it be man woman? So I think in bathrooms, I think you can make a reasonable argument that no, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't be trans woman, or it should be unisex. It doesn't matter. Anybody can go in any bathroom. I think you can make a good case there. And I think there are other aspects of the law, other aspects of our society where you can make a similar case where it says, okay, we've traditionally defined it this way, more utility to not define it in the traditional sense, biological sense, so we're not going to do it anymore. I can agree with that. I think that makes sense to do that. Other instances that we've kind of talked about, I think that there are places where you can go by identity, and there are places where you can go by the biological reality. And I think trans woman can be a woman. It go by identity in every scenario, and that's when I have a problem. So there are places where we can. There are places where we can talk about which biology or identity. In my world, your world, it seems like we can't. It's all got to be identity.
Well, because 99% of the time we're talking about identity. Like very rarely in society we refer to some underlying like biological truth, where we're just kind of like describing where we're using like broad categories like he or she. Like I don't know. That's just how it feels to me. I don't think there's like I don't think that like that much value exists in calling someone like a man or a woman. It's not like this is like giving you like this rigid set of characteristics. Like if I ask you like, can you describe to me somebody, and they're like, oh, that's a woman. It's like, well, fuck, I don't know what the fuck that means. Like you have to tell me way more than that.
Right. You don't know what it means. So when you kept saying, what, got to go back to what does it mean, and when you get rid of the biological category completely in aspects of of our language, then I think again, like you're opening up like a Pandora's box of it gets very confusing. A lot of questions here. So that's why in my world, back to, okay, why is this social system been constructed? If it's highly related to the biology, we stick with the biology. If it's not, if there are other considerations that are more towards the forefront, then we get rid of that. We say, okay, now trans women, same thing in this particular arena.
I guess like
in my world,
I don't know. I guess it views to me it feels to me when we're making these arguments, it just feels like a way like an exclusionary thing that only hurts people right now. Like I don't.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
It just feels like an exclusionary thing to hurt trans people right now. Like I don't know, like it kind of feels like the category of like white or black. Like the category of white, for instance, like people might argue that this is a very real thing that like definitely describes something. It's like, well, not really.
I wanted to talk about this. So that this brings up another point that I wanted to talk about, which was we currently have anti-discrimination laws. You have to pay, men and women have to be paid equally, and if you find a discrepancy, face legal fine. Same thing along race lines. So one, to me, if you're going to say that gender is an identity, you have to say race is an identity. I don't see any. And two, it seems like this could definitely be used to circumvent these protections that have been in place, especially in larger businesses. It's less likely to happen, but in smaller businesses, I think that you run into an issue there.
Hold on. So if I could follow this whole argument, so you're saying that. Are you saying that like people are going to identify as different genders to qualify for like affirmative action programs, or?
Well, I think we have seen it. I know I've read individual stories. I think. Well, never mind. I won't get into that. But I'm pretty sure I have seen individual stories where people will identify as a minority race to get one, not even affirmative action. I wasn't really thinking about affirmative action.
Also, yeah, maybe like in a minority race, but I mean like that shit is like I mean, but like the whole concept of race, I mean like if anything that like in a way that's almost putting my argument that these categories are like very messy and almost arbitrary sometimes in terms of like how these categories are defined. So like for instance, like today, well, for all purposes in society, I'd be considered white. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but I'm also like half Cuban. So like what is my race, or
if we identify as black and
I don't think white.
If a man identifies as a woman, I think you absolutely can say you identify as black, and we saw this with Rachel Dolezal.
Oh fuck, I haven't read about this shit. Hold on, this is like the
go-to. I can give a brief synopsis. Dolezal, I think she was like a leader in the NAACP or some black organization. She was high up there, and she actually was a white person, identified as black. I don't know if she was trolling or if she sincerely felt that way, but she identified as black, and it came out. It was this big deal. And then on top of that, there was an article written in, I believe, Hypatia, which said exactly what I'm saying, was that, well, if we're going to accept transgender arguments, then we have to accept that race is also an identity, and you can identify as a different race. And I think something like, don't quote me on the number, but like something like 400 academics, I think, wrote in and like absolutely livid. They thought that this was completely like over the top racist to make that suggestion.
Well, so like, I mean, that's because like there is, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there is any psychological literature on transracial people. This is not something that like seems to be something that actually exists or happens.
When you say it doesn't exist or happen, it has happened. And when you say there's no psychological literature on it, well, it doesn't exist yet. If you went back 200 years in the DSM, I don't know if it exists back then. If you go back to the beginning of the DSM, I don't know if you would see it on. You do, but I think it'd be reasonable.
Yeah, but like we can,
but to not have happened.
We can go back thousands of years and have accounts of people that feel like they were women born into men's bodies or men born into women's bodies. Like we have accounts
people
of
born into cat bodies.
No, not that. we have like accounts of trans people for a long time. We don't have accounts of like transracial people, or not that I'm aware of. These are where a white man felt that he was born black or as an other kid. Like I think that like transgender people have existed for about as like long as we've been writing stories, and that seems to be a feature of a person's mind that somebody could be born with this type of thing. But I don't I'm not aware of it. I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of a broad history of like people being born into what they felt like was the wrong race. That like
Right.
10,000 years ago, people were writing murals on walls saying, "I too, Krug the caveman, identify as an attack helicopter." I don't think this has actually happened.
Well, so a couple things there. I don't think so. The world has gotten a lot more global
Hmm.
10,000 years. So these races, you didn't see them for the most part unless you were some sort of traveler. Um, so yes, you might be right in saying that it didn't exist back then, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists in relation to our current society, in which case we do know it does exist. I think you said something similar about that before, whereas if we got rid of these categories, I think you said then there are trans women. You said something along the lines of if we got rid of these categories, then there are trans women who would then no longer identify as trans. I don't remember exact argument, but it was
And like in a
some.
different society, basically, where gender roles weren't as rigidly defined, maybe some trans people wouldn't necessarily feel like a big gender dysphoria. They would just
Right,
be.
so that means it's part based on society, and I think when you say that we don't have a history of transracial identities, well, again, it's partly based on society. It's also partly based. I agree, it's partly based on biology.
Well, everything is
I've got
based
no
on
doubt in my
biology
mind.
and society.
Look happy,
That's
you're on
literally every trait we
vacation,
have, right?
smiley
Well,
face.
right. I'll be more specific. Something to trans women that there's a biological, there's something like in born to make them feel that way. I don't real. I think that there's biological aspect to it. But the question is, okay, how do you go about categorizing these people? And biology, if you're not going to do it on reproducibility or male brain versus female brain, but you're going to do it on identity, these issues. So to me, it's either got to be biology, these male brain, female brain, or something similar, or identity. I don't see another option. You seem to be putting forth an identity option, and it opens up a ton of issues with.
I see these issues, but I think I feel like the issues that you see come from like a lack of understanding of what a trans person is. Like we've seen like on fMRIs and shit, like trans people's brains actually look like the brain of like the person that they identify with. I'm not aware that like we cut into a person's body and like, oh my god, this white person actually had like black like sickle cell anemia, like a black person's thing or whatever, or like I think that this is I
Well,
think
is
this
it
is like a
biology or is it identity? That's what
well,
I'm asking. When we're talking about trans, are we referring to brain, or are we referring to identity?
for trans people we're referring to identity. For
Okay,
trans
so I don't see why you can't apply that same argument to race. So I'm saying that you, as a white person, could identify as a black person, as a black woman. Um, I don't see why your notion of the world, we can do this. I don't see any pause in doing this.
I I guess I guess when I think of like when I try to think of like trans people as like a thing that exists in humans, that there are like some women that identify as men or some men that identify as women, like things that we biologically assign don't seem to match up. I just can't think of like I have never heard of like racial dysphoria that like a white person felt like so strongly that they were black that they started cutting themselves because of how they saw themselves. I mean, I guess there are some white people that like wear baggy pants. I don't know if these are like considered like category of black to you, but I don't. Yeah, I'm just not. I just don't think this is a real thing, and I just don't think that like if we say like, hey, trans
Right.
people exist and it's like part of the medical literature, we can observe it in a million ways. Oh well, now all of a sudden we've got somebody that's like a trans wallet that wants their ass to be filled with credit cards. Like I don't think we get from A to B here. I think this is a slippery slope that where you haven't demonstrated how we go from one to the other than just saying like, well,
Well,
it's Pandora's box.
they do exist. So you can say they exist in what number? Transracial, I don't know, but did again? There's been documentaries. That's a thing. Weird,
Well,
but
then to be clear, when we
I
say
think
there
you
are
have to do the
documentaries, we're
other
saying
things
that
the same.
they're like entertainment things that are made like following like a really funny or interesting story. There's not like a documentary of like the plight of like other kin people like that exists like all over the world that are killing themselves and like psychologists are trying to treat them. Like it's more just like here are a couple of like funny stories and like this is what we're following, right?
No. See, you're saying it's funny, and that's how most people thought of trans until it became a big issue. So you're simply dismissing it. I'm saying that's how most people treated trans, how most people still treat trans. They dismiss it because they think it's funny. It's a super small percentage of the population. It's like 0.7%. Um, so
Yeah, but the
other
difference
kids
is
are
like
probably a lot less. You don't dismiss
transgender
it.
the difference is like transgender people have always existed and have always had like severe problems related to being trans. I've never heard of like otherkins being like the historical thing that like people in Egypt were killing themselves because they weren't actually cats or
Okay.
something like.
Well, then I say, well, let's do this. Let's
Mm-hmm.
assume that you now do your research and you find that it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
How does that change? How does that change your viewpoint? I mean, do we then say if somebody identifies as a cat, we should do our best to treat them as a cat. If they want a litter box in the bathroom at work, then we should put it in there for them. Because again, there's no harm, right?
I mean, if we actually did the research and that's how it came out to be, well, then yeah, I guess sure. If it keeps people from killing themselves or whatever, and it makes them more productive members of society, then yeah,
I
sure.
don't think it's got to be just killing themselves. You go back to killing themselves, and you're right. Trans women or trans people. I shouldn't. I keep going
Uh-huh.
defaulting to trans women, but trans people are killing themselves at like 40%.
Uh-huh.
But it doesn't have to be just killing yourself for it to be a problem.
Okay,
It can cause
experiencing like
intense emotional
severe,
distress.
yeah,
No
severe
problem.
mental anguish that makes them not contribute as well to society or live like fulfilling lives. Sure.
Right. So I'm saying let's say we agree. Let's say we do the research and we agree
Mm-hmm.
together that it happens to be that these people really do exist. They really are experiencing mental anguish.
Okay.
It's not just a weird thing. Um, you've got to give them the same considerations you would give trans, and then
Yeah,
make
if
that
we do
leap.
the research and find out the real thing, then yeah, sure, I guess sure. Yeah, that doesn't bother me, I guess.
Right. So it doesn't bother you, but putting I mean, you're fundamentally altering the categorization of person at that point
Yeah, but we've
versus
already done this throughout human history. We do this a ton. Like this has already happened. Like black people, we consider people today. We didn't 250 years ago. But we fundamentally altered how we considered black people when Southern people wanted more voting rights, right? They were 3/5 a person then. I mean, like, what's the problem with this? We change these categories all the time.
right. So it goes down to okay, what is a person?
That's a really good question. I mean,
Well, yeah, I don't want to get into abortion,
well,
please.
I mean, hey, it's a good question, and these categories are, and when you actually start tearing into this, it's really fucking uncomfortable. But the reality is that at the end of the day, all of it is kind of arbitrary. What is a person? Is it a zygote? Is it literally the moment like a male sperm and a female ovum come together and make something? Is it somebody that has an experience whose brain starts to develop? I don't know. These are really fucking hard questions. But to sit here and pretend, and like I hear this a lot, and I'm not saying you're not the only one that does this, but it's like, well, we get these answers from science. No, we don't. Science doesn't answer any of these questions. Science doesn't tell us whether or not a black person is a human the same way that a white person is a human, because science doesn't even tell us what a human is, right? We can just.
Well, okay, so I gotta interrupt here because
Mhm.
the fundamental nature of reality, I think you have definitions and you have reason, and I guess because you have definitions, you could say you have language. Although that's just for now, you have definitions and reason. So you talk about a circle. It's points. It's it's an infinite number of points, equidistant from a center point. You say, okay,
Well,
what's
so
the
like
point?
math doesn't work here because math is something that stems from logic, right? If we talk about a circle, the definition of a circle is going to necessarily extend from axioms that we establish mathematically. So sure, logically that's true. But now if we talk about like what is a ball, now I can give you a rigid mathematical definition of a sphere. Okay, we can tell you how to calculate its circumference, its area, and all of that. But now let's say I give you a ball. Well, does a ball exist? Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if balls exist are a feature of the world. I know that there is like a collection of matter that we can describe. Like maybe there are certain atoms. Do atoms exist? Well, I don't know. I mean, you've got protons and neutrons and electrons. Those exist. Well, do those exist? Well, I don't know. We've got quarks, right? Like this is like, I mean, we can get into.
I think if you're going down, do they exist? You get into what is consciousness and all that. What I was kind of getting at is feeling, and I got this when you were debating Sargon, is that you have, whether intentional or not, you have this sort of like postmodernist. Okay, but it seems to me that you have almost this like postmodernist taste where you just want to deconstruct everything. And what I'm saying is when you deconstruct everything, no point where you can stop, or there's no point. You can keep going forever and deconstruct everything to the point where you're questioning. Okay, and what I'm saying is the same thing applies when we're talking about this trans woman and trans man, and that's why I got into otherkins. Okay, it's kept going, and then once you say, okay, we agree, otherkins are you can identify a person can identify as an animal, and that erodes the category of person. You can keep going, and there's no point where you can stop. So there are postmodernists who do question the fundamental axioms of mathematics, and they say that, okay, all these relations that exist in society are then a result of power. But when you get down to it, and start questioning reason, it bothers me, because I see it as a question of reason to reconstruct the world with. You've got nothing to convince me you're right. So I'm not saying.
Well, yeah. So here, okay, yeah. So like, we can run down this hole if you really want to. But I believe in reason. I believe in like if we want to get into like things related to like epistemology, right? Like I believe in like deductive logic. Okay, I believe in parts of empiricism and rationalism. I believe that there are things that we are granted to us a priori, that there are things that we know without any relation to the world. So for instance, we know that something can't be and not be. We know that something that is a thing, right? Laws of identity, laws of non-contradiction. I believe in forms of empiricism, that we know the world through our senses. I believe that our sense data should be accurate. It should convey some measure of truth about the world or some underlying powerfully, right? So these are things that I believe. So when we talk about reason, if we're talking about that, in terms of like deconstructing everything, I think that deconstructing things, so initially, if you've never done it before, deconstruction is scary because you don't want to consider that something that you believe in can be deconstructed. But there's a power in that. Like if you deconstruct something and you're aware that it can be deconstructed, then it gives you the power to recognize, well, okay, if this thing can be deconstructed, maybe it can be different. And ultimately, I think that it's empowering at the end of the day to know that a category isn't something handed down to us by the institutions of science or by some Fox News anchor or whatever. Like, these categories exist because they make our lives better. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all we want is to live the happiest lives we can. So if we understand that these categories can be deconstructed and built into something different, if it makes us happier, then by all means, I think we should do it. I think there's a power there in a postmodern analysis of some highly modernized way of viewing the world. I think there's a lot of power to be had there.
That there is some power there, but as postmodernists have done, you can take it. I think some people have taken it too far, and I'm saying I see the same thing happening here. So we start with gender, and then it goes to, okay, there are other kins. I mean, a lot of research in this, but they exist. And then once you question gender, now you've questioned, and then it kind of opens up Pandora's box. So
yeah, wait, I love that though. I don't know. I don't even know what you said because your mic cut off after gender. But yeah, we should question all of these things constantly. I think. Yeah, of course.
I agree. We should question it. I'm open to questioning it. I think there's power there. when you keep breaking these things down. So it's not like you're just breaking down gender when we talk about this transgender argument. You're breaking down the why did we originally go into man and female, man and woman, based on their ability to reproduce. And then you can make that same argument. Why do we break down species into different categories? Which again goes down to, I don't know if it's just the ability to reproduce, but a large part of it is based on the ability to reproduce.
I think that's like, maybe that's just like our fundamental disagreement, and maybe we should have just either resolved that or kind of ended on that. I don't agree that I just don't agree that when we refer to people as men or women, that we're talking about their ability to reproduce. I don't think we know that even most of the time. If I see a woman in an aisle at
Most
a
of the time, you're right. I think most of the time we don't.
Yeah.
But I think it's there. I think it's underlying it.
Well, but like if you just said that most of the time we don't, then that's my argument. Most of the time we don't. So we can refer to trans men as men and trans women as women, and that's fine. And for the times when we do need those specific like definitions, those are going to be very rare. That's going to be like in a doctor's office or like at a fertility clinic. Like it's going to be like these niche situations, or like situations reserved for a one.
I want to pause you there, because those niche situations are happening where so you don't listen to kind of right-wing websites, so this is probably off your radar, but there are doctors who there are students who are getting deducted points for saying I would put if a trans woman comes into my office, I would put man on the chart, and there are doctors who are students losing points because of this. And there are people, I think a couple have happened in the UK where they've lost their jobs. So you're saying that, yeah, in certain situations like a doctor's office, we should go back to the biology, and it's not happening.
I would be like, I would have to see, I would be super curious to see stories where doctors lose their jobs for writing like biological sex on a document.
For refusing to this actually happened where I think there was like a medical problem where someone like went into the emergency room. I don't have all these stories on hand. They're just things that I've
for sure,
and are in the back of my mind.
Well, like I mean, I would be super curious if a trans woman was trying to get an appointment at like an OBGYN, and the OBGYN was like, I'm sorry, like I don't do penises, and then they got fired for that. Like I would be super curious if that actually was happening. I don't think.
Well, not I don't do penises, but I think like when they're coming in and somebody comes into the emergency room and you're writing down like on a form, is this a man or a woman, where it says sex, and it's a trans woman, and you put man. This has been coming up again. I think it's pretty fringe. Like it doesn't happen a ton, more and more, and just because it's not happening a ton now doesn't mean it won't happen a lot in the future. I'm
curious if we can agree on this. If we just recognize that there's a difference between like gender and sex, and if we say that like man or woman can be gender and like male or female can refer to like genitalia, like would you be okay with that distinction? And then trans men or trans women just get the pronouns that are related to trans men or trans women? Would you be okay with like that distinction, or do you think even that's like too far? That's the Pandora's box.
So I think when we're talking me and you, we can agree that we can use different words to refer to biological sex versus gender expression. And that's where I kind of went that way. I said, okay, well, I wanted to use different words because I wanted to resolve the tension in the argument. But so maybe, we could disagree on what those words should be, but we probably could agree that we could use different words and that would solve a lot of issues, not all of them. But the question also exists outside of us. We may agree on what those words would be, but there's an entire world of 7 billion people who will disagree with us. I go back to, as a conservative, what should the rules be? That's where I go back to when trying to discuss these difficult issues, is what should the rules be? To me, calling a trans woman a trans woman instead of a woman resolves these issues as well as they can be resolved.
But it doesn't resolve the issues of trans people being like super at risk for like mental illness, for things like depression or anxiety or suicide.
I don't know that it doesn't, because that saying, okay, you're a trans woman versus you're a woman, I don't know if that's going to cause them to commit suicide. I have a hard time, and I've already said that there are a lot of places where we can default to something other than biology. I've granted that point. I just don't want to grant the point categorization, that there is a categorization of biology. We don't use it. We can disagree. We can agree or disagree what social system uses. That categorization needs to exist. And I am saying man and woman does represent that category, and that trans woman and trans man would represent the category of identity.
Okay.
I think we can agree on a lot of things and disagree on the nitpicky stuff, maybe.
Gotcha. Okay. I mean, I think I disagree, but I mean, I understand your point. So I guess like just to restate my final argument, like I just, if I call all trans women women, I don't think that represents like any measurable harm to any part of society, or at least no more harm than not referring to them as that, and having these other weird things where trans men are going into like female bathrooms or trans women are going into male saunas or whatever. Like I think that referring to people as they want to be referred to, trans women as women, trans men as men, like takes care of about as much as you possibly can, understanding like the way that we set up like man and woman to refer to people, and that to truly alleviate these problems, we would have to go the full-on gender abolition route. That's my final point, and then you can have the final word.
Yeah. So when we do this, when we say that you have this man and woman, and they've traditionally been dichotomous, they've been mutually exclusive, and then to redefine the word so as to include the antonym, it leads to problems. It leads to problems with logic and reason. So I propose this tension so that we use different words for the different things. And I think it makes most sense to stick with biological category, and using new words to describe gender as an identity, which has come around, I think we'll say in like 1949 in America, at least. A logical distinction, and it opens up Pandora's box. And then there's another one, which is that I didn't discuss at this point already, but I'll bring it up, which is morality. So whether or not someone's moral, somebody can hold an immoral position and be a moral person. So they believe, I'm an atheist, but Christians believe that homosexuals are going to hell. That doesn't make them an immoral person to me. So then the question becomes, okay, come to different logical conclusions than you and I. So we've agreed on a lot of things today, but there are people who won't agree with us. And when you talk about transphobia, when you're talking about saying somebody is a lesser moral being, that is a whole nother set of problems, because come to their conclusion logically and reasonably, and we're going to call them a lesser moral person for holding that position. That's another set of problems we've opened up.
No, I don't think there's a problem there at all. I think we're getting okay. So I think we're getting we're using these words logic and reason, and I think we're putting like logic and reason has nothing to do with morality. Epistemology, how we arrive at truth, these things are. This is like, in my opinion. Well, we can get into very esoteric. I believe these are totally. These are divorced from morality. So, for instance, like, we can both believe in logic and reason, okay? And we can have two different starting axioms, okay? So let's say we both have the same theories of truth. Let's say that we both believe in logic and reason and deductive reason and all this, okay? All of this is the same for us, okay? But now let's move to metaethics. And I'm going to say, well, I believe fundamentally that we ought to maximize the amount of suffering in the world, and then you believe fundamentally that we ought to minimize the amount of suffering in the world. of sentient beings,
Okay.
okay?
Uh-huh.
Now, both of us can construct moral systems that are fully reasonable. They follow all the rules of logic. But because we have starting axioms that differ from one another, I could fully have a totally different stance. You might say that like we should lock everybody up and torture them constantly, blah 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 blah, and I would say like, well, we shouldn't do that. We should help people, blah blah blah. And it's very strange for you to defend your position and go, well, hold on, my position is logical. Well, sure, of course it is, but just because a position is logical doesn't mean that it should be like morally celebrated or that it's virtuous or that it's good.
I wanted to make a point on this particular issue. So not all starting axioms on morality are the same. Now, I don't believe that morality and logic are fundamentally separate. I think they drive from one another. So, down of how I get my sense of morality. So, my sense of morality comes from innate drives and capacities. So, a drive will be something like self-preservation, procreation, autonomy, something like that. So, something that is innate to us, that we just do. It's hard to explain why we do it. We just do it. And then a capacity would include something like the ability to reason, logic. We have the capacity to empathize, to love, things like that. So to me, when we talk about what is a moral
buddy,
system,
15 months
we look at these drives and capacities, and we say those capacities, which include logic, to come up with a moral system. And I think.
So that okay. So.
I think it better than he leads us to the golden rule.
No. That this is so philosophically, we're going down like a biological essentialism route, which is not a good position to go down. Like just because
I don't know if we're doing that.
Well, just because we have a biological drive for something, we can make that observation. That doesn't make that like a morally virtuous thing. So, for instance, like I'm horny a lot, and I might have like a drive to rape somebody, but that doesn't make it a virtuous action to do it. That way, we would never say that, right?
Well, I disagree, and I had a feeling that this was going to go down this route at some point. So to me,
wait, you disagree with which part?
So when you're saying if we have a drive to rape, then under my logic, we could say it's moral to rape, and I disagree with that, because to me there are certain drives that sometimes this comes down to like the is-ought distinction. How do you go from an is? So we have we have a drive to procreate. I don't think we necessarily have a drive to rape. We have a drive to procreate. We have a drive to self-preservation, but that doesn't mean we ought to do those things. But to me, that thing it's both the is and the ought, in a similar way that like the word pronounceable is pronounceable. I for self-preservation is we ought to pursue. It's hard when you get down that deep into philosophy, but to me that it's almost like self-fulfilling. It is like a call to action.
Yeah. So like I mean I don't want to. So we don't need to go down this far. I just kind of wanted to illustrate that your earlier statement of like it's bad to morally condemn somebody who's being logical. That statement is vacuous. Like you can totally be logically consistent and still be morally condemnable.
Sure, and I fully agree with that. But there are people who can hold a moral. We would, so you might say somebody holds an immoral position, but we would not define their character as bigoted or immoral. So the point I was trying to make was, earlier you said, okay, doctors' offices, we should always stick to the biological because it's relevant. So somebody else could come up with a different conclusion and say, no, we want these people to feel as included as possible. So that requires us to offices to call them a man if they want to be a man and a woman if they want to be a woman. And can go ahead and says, you don't agree with me. You come up with a different, therefore you're a bad person. That's where I have an issue.
Well, so the bad person would be the over why do you disagree with the other person? So, like, for instance, if somebody disagrees with your categorization of people at a hospital, and you say, well, why do you want to categorize one group of people one way and one group of people another? If the doctor says, because this allows me to deliver the most amount of, good in terms of, like, healthy outcomes to people, and then the other person says, like, well, I just want to do it because I'm an SJW, well, then I would say, like, well, the SJW person, they could be logically consistent, but they're still, like, bad. That would be a worse person. I mean, we would call people bad or good. We're saying it relative to our own moral systems anyway, right? But...
No, I think there's objective bad and objective good, but
Well, wait, from where?
okay. Well, hold on. Well, we can go down that route.
Well, this is pretty important because if you believe in an objective bad or good, then that kind of like...
I wanted to make a different point. We can go down there. The point is if SJW route, so society as a whole go down like what we might agree is the SJW route. Evidenced by like the doctor's office scenario we've just discussed. Everybody who has come to a logical conclusion, a reasonable conclusion, and society just keeps calling them moral. You're a bad person, you're a bad person, you're a bad person, you're transphobe, you are a lesser moral being. This is another set of problems that comes up because there are good people who come to reasonable, logical conclusions whose morality is the same for the most part, like 99.9% is the same, except in this one particular instance. And we're going to call them bad people. So creates another problem where
can you falsify the Christian God?
Calling large swaths of people who have reasonable positions, who have moral positions, who just come to different conclusions, you're calling them transphobes, which is to say you're calling them lesser moral beings. That's another problem that arises.
I mean, I don't think it's a problem if you condemn somebody's moral positions, even if they arrive to them in a logical...
disagree. I think it's saying...
I mean, like, we could logically derive, like, Nazism if we wanted to. We could go into... We could derive a whole bunch of, like, positions that we would probably agree are moral. It just depends on what our starting axioms are, or what our meta-ethical statements are. Like...
So, if somebody says, okay, the Book of Islam is deeply immoral, and therefore anybody who agrees with the Book of Islam is also deeply immoral. You're categorizing large swaths of people you don't know who have come to their reasoning. You don't know why they've come to their reasoning. You're categorizing these large swaths of people that you've never met as immoral, and to do that is immoral. All Muslims are immoral. That is in itself immoral. So when you're saying a different conclusion than me on this particular issue of gender is a transphobe and is therefore immoral, that is immoral. And about this argument, that's part of it, and we have to come up with a system where people who have come to different conclusions on these things are both we can agree to disagree and not have the other person immoral. So maybe you don't hold a position that everybody who disagrees with you is a transphobe on this issue, but that's the route I see society going down, and conversation is so important. It's part of the reason why I want to the best system we can. No system's going to be perfect, and it's why I've come to my conclusion that we need to have trans man, trans woman and woman. So that's part of my analysis, and if you want to go to whether or not objective morality exists, I'm happy to do that. But that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Okay, I mean, like, fuck, I understand your points here. Maybe we can have like a secondary discussion, I guess, on morality. But like, fuck, I'm
Hey,
fucking.
you just cut out. What'd you say?
I'm sorry. I understand your points here. Maybe we can have like a secondary discussion of morality. Fuck, I'm kind of tired. It's late.
No, I don't. I'm really thirsty too.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we could. Yeah, I guess maybe we can have another discussion of morality sometime. But
yeah,
okay.
I agree. It's been fun. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, cool. All right.
Good one,
Thanks.
man.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate the conversation, man.
You're saying that the cost of a four-year degree would most likely fall as a result, because then you'd be catching all of the people that were trying to get some sort of education.